Welcome to On the Way Classroom with Tony Crisp. Each weekday, Monday through Friday, Dr. Crisp will teach the Bible from its historical, geographical, linguistic, and cultural context. Tune in daily to start your day right and to deepen your understanding of how to better walk the way and enjoy the journey. Now, here's your host, Dr. Tony Crisp.
Welcome to On the Way Classroom. Today we are continuing our walk through the Intertestamental Period, and we are using as our background text Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that He might redeem those of us who are under the law, and that we might receive the adoption of sons, that we might become a part of God's family. And so we've been looking at God getting the world ready for His Son, the Messiah, to come into the world. And so we've been looking at the development of the synagogue system. Now, the reason I am helping you to understand what took place during this in-between time, between the closing of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament, is because so much of our understanding of this time period aids us in understanding the big picture, the panorama of God. Remember, history is God's story. It's His story. And He is linear. He is going somewhere with time. Time is a created commodity, and it will end one day. Time as we know it. But now we are in this period when God is doing everything that He said He was going to do. And we still have a long way to go in time. If the tribulation period were to start today, we have at least 7 years, then 1,000 years, and then an indefinite period of time that is not named as far as anything but the sequence, and then the new heaven and the new earth. So we're a long way from the end of time. But in time, God does so much to help us to understand who He is and how He works. And so God prepared the world for His Son, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, to come into the world. And the gospel of Jesus, the good news, the preaching of the message of redemption and forgiveness was to go out into first what was called the Greco-Roman world, and then around the world, around the globe in the days in which we're living, and the 2,000 years since the substitutionary death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, His ascension to heaven. He's coming again. From the closing of the Old Testament canon and the last voice of God, who was Malachi the prophet, we have been studying how God was preparing the world for His Son. So we talked about the synagogue system, which was first just a community center. It was called the Beit Knesset, where the Jews that were scattered around the face of the earth, especially in Mesopotamia, they gathered together as a community in pockets where they would accomplish a lot, and then it became a place of teaching during the days just before Jesus and after Jesus. That increased with the destruction of the Second Temple. But the reason these community centers came into existence, remember, is because the first temple that Solomon built was destroyed in 586 BC. 70 years later, in 516, the second temple was built. Now, the Second Temple period lasts from 516 years before Christ until 70 AD. That is, 40 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And so these kinds of things are very important, that we understand the background of the time in which Jesus came. So the synagogue system, as we will see, is very important for the dissemination of the gospel around the world. But let's look today at something else that's very important. After the period of the Persians, which I date the Persian period as it relates to Scripture from 539 BC, that's when Cyrus, the Persian general, overthrew Babylon, all the way down to 333 BC. And that is when Alexander, the one that we call the Great, he was actually Alexander the Third, and we call him Alexander the Great in historical terms because of his military accomplishments. In the area of modern-day Turkey, it was Cilicia, at Issos, there was a decisive battle in 333 BC between Darius, and that's one of the descendants of the Darius that is mentioned in the Bible. He and Alexander's forces met together in what we know as Cilicia, and it was a decisive defeat of the Persians. And so the Persian Empire as such officially ended in 333, and we began what is called the Greek period. Now, Alexander had actually come to power 3 years earlier when his father, Philip, the Macedon, King Philip of Macedonia, was assassinated. He was assassinated at one of his daughter's weddings. And Alexander, immediately at 20 years of age, took over what was then the Empire of Macedonia, or the country of Macedonia. He immediately swept into Hellas. Hellas is the name, the official name of Greece, what we call Greece today. And it is even today called the Hellenic Republic. You've heard of something being Hellenized, Greekized, if we were to say it in a way that we could all understand. When someone was a Hellenist, they were one who had adopted Greek culture, Greek language, the arts, the theater, all that entailed. And so the Hellenization of the intertestamental period is critical for understanding the days in which Jesus lived and the apostles taught and lived, because it was a Hellenistic world. Even though it was a Roman world, the Greeks had such an amazing influence on then and now that much of our language comes from Latin or Greek, which is a base language along with Latin that makes up 90%, approximately 90% of all the words that we have in our vocabulary. You can trace the roots back to either Greek or to Latin language, which the Romans used. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because from that 333 period and the defeat of the Persians, from there, Alexander went through the Levant, Mesopotamia, all the way down into North Africa, and founded the city of Alexandria, that is, as to where it would be. And that became, as you know, a cultural center and a center of education and learning in the ancient world. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I want you to understand that the Greek influence of Alexander the Great is still with us today. But this was a huge part of the getting ready, the preparation for the coming of the Messiah. You say, how so? Well, remember, the synagogue system was in all of the known world at that time. These centers that were sometimes several in a community, and they increased as time went along and the Jewish population increased. But the world did not have one language as such until the days of the Greeks. And Alexander was such a proponent of Greek philosophy, Greek culture. After all, he had studied under the great teacher Aristotle when he was 14, 15, 16 years old. And so he had gained his idea of philosophy and his view of life from Aristotle. And so as Alexander moved eastward, he took his language, he took his culture, his art, everything that was associated with Hellenism, Alexander was very proud of it. Now, for those of you who have seen the movie that came out several years ago, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, many of you remember the father of the woman who was the star and the bride in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And during that time, you'll remember that he was obnoxious in saying to everybody that Greek culture and Greek vocabulary was the center of everything, and he could take any word and trace it back to Greek. That really, to some degree, is true. And so this is what you had during the days of Alexander, this pride in Greek culture and the Greek language and the arts and philosophy. And so Alexander took his philosophy and the arts and the language with him, so that after the days of Alexander the Great, Greek became the lingua franca, that is, the language of society, the language of the day. And so even during the days of the Romans, during the days of Jesus, it was still the world trade language because everyone knew Greek. It's very much like if you went to Africa in days gone by, Swahili was the trade language, and no matter what language you spoke, from whatever tribe, Swahili would have gotten you around the continent of Africa throughout the various nations and tribes in Africa. But it was even more so with Greek because it was worldwide. And so you would have had, Jesus would have known Greek, he would have spoke his everyday language, would have been Aramaic. He would have spoken Hebrew and read Hebrew in anything that had to do with Torah, with the Nevi'im, with the Ketuvim, that is the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament scriptures. That would have been read in the temple, in the synagogues, and so forth. And then they would have probably known Latin as well, certainly enough to read and to get by. Because it's only in the West, only in America, where we have such an emphasis on everybody knowing English. But the fact is that the language of the New Testament, the language, as a matter of fact, in which it was written, was Koine Greek, common Greek. And that common Greek was the language that would get you anywhere in that Roman world, the Greco-Roman world. And so this is an important thing because you see, the synagogue gave an opportunity for the Apostle Paul, who was a rabbi, to have a preaching point in any town or city or hamlet that he went into where there was a Jewish population. Not only that, but he could speak a common language anywhere in the world, in the Roman world that he went. He would have been able to speak Greek and everyone know what he was talking about. Now, this is very important because the New Testament was written in Koine, common Greek, and because of that, everyone in the entire world that knew language could understand and read the Greek New Testament. And so the language of the gospel was Greek, and the places where they would have first preached the gospel to the Jew first would have always been in the synagogues. And so you had a common language, a common meeting place, and those are just two elements in God preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth.
Thanks for listening to On the Way Classroom with Dr. Tony Crisp. Tune in each weekday for more information on how to read, study, and understand the Bible. If you have questions, please write to questions@tonycrisp.org. That's questions@tonycrisp.org. Questions@tonycrisp.org. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day on the way.